Good afternoon, everyone. Today is Thursday, June 22nd, 2023. I'm Dr. Yamonja Smalls, Director of Professional Development for Maryland Department of Health's Developmental Disabilities Administration. We welcome you to today's Rate Review Advisory Group meeting. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few things about the webinar. All participants are in listen-only mode. There are two options to hear the webinar, by computer and phone. If you look at the panel interface on your right, labeled audio, you can click either computer or phone to switch to the best option. We will be recording the webinar and posting this session on the YouTube and DDA website. Today's PowerPoint has also been uploaded as an attachment and is available to you to download in the webinar panel along with today's agenda. Questions can be typed in the question or chat box in the webinar panel, and the team will review and respond as appropriate. And just a reminder, if you're not speaking, to just mute your mic. And now I'd like to introduce Deputy Secretary Bernie Simons to begin today's meeting. Good afternoon, Bernie.
Good afternoon. I want to thank everybody who's here with us and who's been with us for a period of time as the Rate Review Advisory Group. Members doing volunteer, doing a lot of work, having a great commitment, and continuing to meet and dialogue and assist with our overall process. I can't believe that we've got a full year and we're coming to the home stretch on a second year with this group. And so far, I think we've done a good job with identifying, and you've identified issues around the rates for rehabilitation and employment services, and that will be a priority for FY25. To help further develop these priorities and what we're looking at, the data collection tool will be discussed in more detail later today. We will also be discussing the BLS wages for day habit employment, which Robert White will be talking about in further detail. And lastly, our general ledger data collection, which we'll be issuing to the providers to start on July 1. And that tool will be utilized every year. And, when we wrote our contracts with the providers, we put in that, if we give you something and we are going to require it, that you need to be in a contract compliance with that. So, hopefully we don't have to go there and people will just say, yes, this is a good thing. It's a good outcome. It's great for the state. It's great for the Department of Health. It's great for the Developmental Disabilities Administration, and it's going to strengthen our system. So, again, I want to thank you for your dedication. And I also want to now introduce somebody who needs no introduction, our secretary, Dr. Scott.
Thank you. Thank you, Bernie. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, great. So, just wanted to join the call. When I first joined the administration more than 5+ months ago, I joined one RAG meeting when we were kicking off the process, and because of scheduling and the General Assembly, I haven't been able to join. We're in the home stretch, and so I wanted to prioritize this because it's so important. And to all the things that Bernie said, we appreciate your partnership and the input that you've done to date, and we're on the home stretch of the second year. And so wanted to make sure that you knew that I was committed to this process and ensuring that, we get the best decisions on the table. And even though we may not always end up in agreement, we will always consider, everyone's thoughts and ideas about how to move the process forward. But also just again wanted to demonstrate, my commitment to this process and the rest of the team, and to thank you all personally for all the time and effort you've put in to date. So thank you, and I look forward to this meeting and again finishing out the rest of the year strong.
So I think, Jen, you're up. And thank you, Dr. Scott.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. So on our agenda today, we will start with approval of the May meeting minutes. We'll provide the status update of May meeting action items, a general ledger process update from Hilltop, and then we'll dive into FY25 rate review priorities, and we will also, time permitting, have some time for open discussion before we close. The next slide, please. So as a reminder, this advisory group is part of the structure implemented to further MDH's commitment to the development of adequate and sustainable rates that promote the vision and mission of the DDA. And the commitment members have made to participate ensures an open and transparent process to review rates. Go to the next slide, please. So our next item for today is to review and approve the minutes. Members were sent an email with meeting minutes on June 16th. As co-chair, I will make a motion to approve the minutes. Would a member like to second?
This is Chris, I'll second.
All right, thank you. All in favor of approving the May minutes? Any opposed or any comments? Okay, then the May minutes are approved. Thank you. And now we are going to turn it over to Robert for some policy updates from DDA.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer, and good afternoon, everyone. We have a few rate-related policy updates that we want to share with you today. These policy updates have been approved by the DDA and the department and are final. First, we'll start with the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or BLS, wage data. The FY 2025 rates will include an adjustment to the BLS wage for day-hab and employment services, consistent with these services being identified as our rate priorities for this rate cycle, with the exception of the geo-differential rate for large group. For large group, we made a one-time policy decision to not reduce the rate due to our concerns that the pandemic may potentially be skewing the BLS data in this instance. The BLS wage is being updated using the 2021 BLS wage data. And later in the presentation, Caleb from Optimus will share more on the BLS wage adjustments. And then I will also share a list of the services that are impacted. Moving on to CPI versus COLA. As y'all are aware, the mandated COLA increases have been accelerated forward for both FY25 and FY26 to January 1 of 2024. We will not incorporate any additional CPI into the FY25 rates. Applying both CPI and COLA in the same fiscal year would be inconsistent with how we have addressed these increases in the past. And any future adjustments due to COLA or CPI beyond FY25 will obviously be contingent on budget discussions with the department. For service adjustments, we have decided to update the base data used for facility closures. This adjustment incorporates the latest 3 years of closure data from 2020 through 2022. And the decision to include the latest 3 years for the most available closure data is intended to place more weight on the most recent data available for this component. This results in an updated percentage of 4.4%, up from the current percentage of 3.6%, which would have an impact of 0.8% on the actual rates. And then we're very excited to talk about the training matrix. The new training matrix was shared with providers as well as CCS agencies a few weeks ago. And we're excited to announce that the FY25 rates will have an updated hours assumption for training based on policy decisions. In addition, keep in mind that the training adjustment could potentially be impacted by the turnover data that we received from the data collection tool that was due on June 9th. The most recent data request is currently being reviewed by Optimus, and they'll be providing an update on where they are with that later in the presentation. The updated training matrix included an additional 13 hours for the DSP1s and 1 hour for DSP1s with medication and behavioral training. And again, Chris Welch from Optimus will speak to these changes more a little later in the presentation. Next slide, please.
Robert, this is Scott. I'm a little confused on the CPI and COLA, and it's, I think, just ignorance on my part. Could you kind of repeat what you said for me?
Sure. So the as you know, the COLAs for FY25 and for FY26 were accelerated.
And you're referring to the legislative related to minimum wage when you say that?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
And if you recall, during the last meeting, there was some discussion around implementing CPI and COLA to address cost of living issues moving forward. And so we have made a decision that moving forward for FY25, we won't be applying a CPI adjustment, and any future application of either CPI or COLA will be contingent on budget discussions within the department.
Okay. It strikes me that there's a difference between a mandated minimum wage and a COLA, but I appreciate what you've said, Robert. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Robert, can I jump in? I want to clarify. You know, our recommendation was never that there be CPI and COLA both applied, which is what it sounded like you heard us say. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but since you've said that these decisions are final, then I guess I need to just say this feels like a decision that is completely inconsistent with what the department has said their commitment to this process would be for the last 8 years, and is really really creates a situation where instead of us knowing what the rate should actually be based on what's happening in the economy, it is based on a political decision, which is what a rate increase is. It's a political decision made by the department and the governor and the General Assembly. And, you know, we face right now, we're coming to the end of, you know, something close to a mandated rate increase. And so if moving forward, there aren't adequate rate increases, that will suppress not only the rate in that year, but rates moving forward when that's factored in instead of actually looking at the economy. You know, we have a history in this field of very, very poor to no rate increases for many years at a time. And so when you look at the history, it is very concerning that the department would make this decision.
So Laura, if I can jump in, and maybe if you can just clarify the first point that you made about the process. Again, at least my understanding is, you know, this process was put in place to get feedback on the work that we're doing, but even with all things being considered, you know, in the decision making, if there's disagreement, at some point we have to make the decision to move forward. And for this particular issue, at least based on the notes that I have, and I thought a discussion that you and I had was there was advocacy for CPI and COLA. And, you know, going back historically, we've never applied both in the same year. So even considering that would be inconsistent. And Maria, I see you shaking your head. So, you know, help me understand that. But again, moving up the COLA increases the rates in such a way. And as Robert said, you know, these discussions are ongoing pending availability of funds, but this was of the two, the higher of the two. And so we felt comfortable saying that's the rate we're going with moving forward for FY25.
Right. Well, to be clear, if it was heard that way and I was unclear, I apologize, but I've never suggested that both CPI and the rate increase be the factor to increase the BLS wage. And in the short term, I understand that because we are at kind of the tail end of these rate increases as mandated connected to the minimum wage, it is a considerable increase. Although when you look at CPI, you know, 22 to 23 was a 9% increase. So I don't know how far off those numbers would be. And I think, you know, the approach that the department committed to was we would, you know, there would be rate setting and then to determine what the appropriate funding should be. And then there's a funded rate. And knowing that, you know, advocacy and decisions made by a lot of different people across state government would then decide what the funded rate would be. But this, I mean, this does feel like, you know, maybe it's CPI, maybe it's COLA. It feels like that approach is inconsistent with saying this will be a data-driven process.
So I respectfully disagree with the data-driven process, and clearly your comments are on the record. So it's noted, but we've made the decision to move forward with the COLA.
So this is Donna. So moving forward with the COLA for 2025. So if I heard you correctly, Robert, moving forward after that would still in itself be a decision at that point in time, whether it was COLA or whether it was CPI. Is that what you're saying for moving forward in the future as well? That the department would make the decision which it would be?
I think, you know, which would be contingent on whether or not the General Assembly passed legislation reinstating the mandatory annual increases. Does that help, Donna?
I guess because, I don't know, I think back to the very beginning of this process and, you know, it's kind of what Laura said earlier, where this group was charged with really getting into the weeds as to what the rate should be, which we know may be different than what the funded rate may be. And so I think it's just moving forward and looking for that consistency of what's applied to BLS and not each time making the decision which would be applied. And so I think, even in my mind, I think about it as the economy and cost of living, and using that, if you chose to use the CPI, that's the consistent application each year based on the economy. But now what I'm hearing is, you know, it'll be decided each time whether it's, if there's a COLA, if the COLA is used, or if the CPI is used. I just want to make sure that that's correct.
That's correct, Donna.
Okay.
Okay, and I know we have a lot of things to cover in a short period of time, so I'd like to move us on. So here's
Robert, it's Chris. If I could just add one thing to that. I don't want to lose sight of what our original vision was, which was to determine what the adequate rate for the service should be. I think we went into this, all agreed that we knew that that rate may not be funded or fully funded. And we talked about 90%, 85%, whatever that case may be. The concern that I have is that by doing the adjustment the way we're talking about doing it now, we're doing it on the front end of the equation. And by doing that, I feel like we're losing the work that we've done over the years to come to what the rate should be, not what we can afford. And we all recognize that it was an adjustment. There was going to be an adjustment at the end to go from, we determined the rate should be $100 per hour for the service, yet the state's budget allows $90 per hour. And with that recognition, but I think in the methodology that we're talking about now, we long-term, I don't think we're able to hold on to the rate that we were intending to create, which was what was the actual cost of the service, not what we can afford. We've kind of, instead of keeping it in the integrity of that piece of it and then determining an adjustment to get to the budget, now we're doing the budget through the rate. And again, I think that wasn't our original intent.
So Christian, can you elaborate I mean, the COLA represents approximately an 8% increase in the wages from FY24. So what in what you just shared and what we're describing as the increase for 25, where's the miss? Explain that to me, because I'm not understanding what the miss is.
And it's a fantastic question. Thank you. I don't think that the miss is potentially now. I mean, we're playing with some money in the state's budget. There's certainly resources there to make adjustments to the rate. Leap forward 5-10 years, and in the lack of ability for the state to fund it at that point, or to make a COLA or a CPI adjustment, because the mechanism is in the rate, instead of leaving the rate's integrity alone and saying we're only able to fund the back end, on the back end, the rate at 90% or at 95%. We lose the ability, the integrity of that rate moving forward is how I see it.
So I hear that, but I think as we go through the process, that's what we're trying to establish, right, is the baseline. And the more time we're doing this rate setting process, the better we will get at this, right? So it'll be more, you can plan for it better. But there's still a lot of unknowns because we're so new in the process. This is only the second year that we're trying to establish rates. So even to have a baseline with last year coming out of the heels of COVID, this is probably the first full year, and I'm using that loosely as I think about spend across the healthcare delivery system. This is probably the first full year since 2019 that we might be seeing regular utilization of services, and you pick your service. So that's where we're trying to figure out. And I don't think this is in any way suggesting that in next year's negotiation, as we learn more, especially on the heels of the work that you are all doing related to the data collection in the general ledger, we'll get better at this. But I don't think that making a decision on the COLA now, especially because it is a significant increase from FY24, is precluding any other discussions the way you're describing. It's just making the decision now based on the decision we have today.
In the circumstances where the state is unable to provide a COLA or a CPI adjustment, moving forward, though, that effect will trickle through the multiple years after. And I think that's where my concern is that if we did the adjustment on the back end, then the rate is still, the integrity of the rate, the structure, the BLS, how the components factor off of the BLS rate are all still there in an alignment based on the provider's expenses and the way the services have lined up. And then, because there may be a year, I mean, let's be honest, it's been that way in the past. There's been a year where we haven't been able to get anything. And if that is then factored into the rate, we then have changed the rate, as opposed to saying the rate is still should be this, but we know we can only fund it. And I'm just concerned. Right now it's fine, but in a situation where we don't have the resources, that impact is going to be, we're going to move down a different path.
It sounds to me like we're conflating these, what we do to address cost of living increases or CPI with the data that we will be collecting on an annual basis to refresh the data that feeds into the cost components that feed into the fully loaded brick. So that will continue to be an ongoing process. We will continue to look at the BLS during rebase year. And when we're collecting that cost information, that's why it's so important that every provider complete those data collection tools when we send them out. I mean, in essence, you're kind of pulling in some of those inflationary factors as well, because we're only looking back at a short period of time. So with the BLS, we just trended them forward, I believe, using the 21 or 20 or 21 data. So the data that we collect from you all is going to, give a more accurate picture of how costs are changing. And that's what feeds into the fully funded brick, Chris, and whether or not we need to play with funding percentages. We're not letting the budget drive the process. So we're going to do what we need to do to make sure we have adequate rates. And when it comes time for the budget, and we understand what that is, then we would have to look at funding percentages. But the state has always dealt with cost of living increases outside of that through the mandated increases that went into effect 4 years ago. So I don't want to caution us from kind of conflating the two and assuming that we've been applying it to the baseline prior to the budgeting process and then backing off on the funding rate to fit within a mode. So
I'm concerned, this is Maria, just from an actuarial perspective, that the state's conflating the legislative increases and then the wage increases. So the way the math works, if we took out the cost of living adjustment, it would be just, you're basically just saying, let's take the old rate at the BLS that we have in the base and add 4% to the rate. So it's the same. I think the math is you end up at the same place, but I think what at least I'm understanding is that we want a BLS wage that's an accurate projection of what we think the wages will be in fiscal 24. And that's not represented by using the legislative increases. That's represented by using a CPI. And so if you only have the budget for a 4% increase or 8% increase, then the mechanism for making that adjustment is the funding level as opposed to the trend on a BLS wage, because that's where I think we're conflating two different kinds of assumptions. And I think the ask is that the methodology be accurate to accurately project the BLS wage.
Okay, so we've noted your feedback there, Maria. Can we go back to slide number 6, please? Great. This is a list of the topics along with the status updates from the May meeting. The GL template was finalized and distributed to providers, and actually went out to providers on May 19th. We also had 3 well-attended training seminars for providers. Very interactive, lots of great questions. We also did a Q&A session related to the Optimus data collection tool. Those were held on May 24th and 31st, and Optimus is currently reviewing that information, the data that was submitted from the provider community, and will be giving an update on where they are with that. Hilltop will also give an update on where they are with the general ledger data collection process. And having said that, I'm now going to turn it over to Kristen and the Hilltop team to give an update on the GL data collection process. Next slide, please.
Okay, good afternoon. Thanks, Robert. Next slide, please. So good afternoon. There has been great progress with the identified next steps for the general ledger data collection template implementation process discussed at our last meeting. Since we last met, all of the general ledger documents, including the instructions document, the general ledger template collection tool, as well as an example data collection tool, were shared with the provider community and have been posted to the DDA website for reference. We held 3 training sessions in June on the 6th, the 12th, and the 14th, each with a focus on a different set of services, so targeted residential services, support services, and meaningful day services. There were over 200 unique individuals who registered for these trainings, and attendance surpassed 300 individuals across the 3 training sessions. So as Robert mentioned, we had some great interactive sessions with lots of good questions from the providers. Each of the training sessions was recorded and has been posted to the RRAG website under the General Ledger Data Collection Tool Resources section, so they're available for those who may not have been able to join us. We also have compiled a frequently asked questions document highlighting the questions that were posed by providers during the sessions, and this has also been posted to the website and is available for review. And I know we've talked a lot about the process for the development of this tool, and so this slide just again highlights the iterative process and really the essential partner that the RRAG has been in the process to review and refine the template over the past several months. We truly appreciate the efforts and the time of the RRAG. Your ability to review, discuss with us, and provide that iterative feedback has gotten us to the tool that's been sent to providers and we're looking to implement. As we transition to this next phase of the data collection cycle, so transitioning from our development to the implementation phase, we are again asking the RRAG for their continued support in encouraging your networks and providers to review the tool and be prepared to submit data for fiscal 24. Already in this meeting, we've had some great discussions that highlight the importance of being able to get that data from all of the providers in the system. So we really do encourage you to talk with your peers and networks and providers, have them reach out for technical assistance as needed as they're reviewing the tool. The ability for the providers to submit that data collection tool really is integral to support our data-driven rate review process. The tool will be used annually, as we've discussed, to identify the priorities and be able to address the priorities. And then, eventually as we work towards a rate rebase, this data will be essential for that process. And we've also talked about, again, the importance of just the number of providers that it takes to get a significant amount of data to be able to use it to make those data-driven decisions. And so really this slide, again, just highlights all of the different activities that we've taken and highlighting at the end that we're really getting ready to implement with data collection starting on July 1st. And then just reiterating again the technical assistance that's available to providers by request, and this will be available ongoing. Next slide, please. So again, this just highlights all of the technical assistance that's been provided. There is a link to the recorded webinars as well as all of the documents and the frequently asked questions document. Then you can see the different sessions that were provided. So as you look at the recordings, you can choose the session needed to address the services that you provide. Again, the Hilltop rate team is still available for one-on-one meetings with providers. Please feel free to reach out to us anytime. You can reach us at the email address on the screen. And again, just highlighting the key dates that we're going to be beginning the data collection starting on July 1st, and the data will be due in September of 2024. And so as that date gets closer, there'll be ongoing communication with providers about how we will be collecting that data, how it can be submitted, and again, being available to answer any questions that come up. So again, we just appreciate all the support of the RRAG and look forward to transitioning into our implementation and data collection phase. Thanks.
Kristen, this is Chris Parks. Just a quick question, and it may really be for Robert. We've been back and forth a couple times about whether the general ledger data collection tool was going to be required to be completed by providers, and I think we said yes, and then we said no, and then we said maybe. has a final decision been made of whether this tool will be required on an annual basis moving forward?
I'll answer that question. Maybe I wasn't clear in my opening remarks. The answer is yes, we're going to require it on an annual basis.
Fantastic. Bernie, I apologize if I missed that. Thank you.
Hi, this is Caleb Levon at Optimus. I'm going to be talking about the priorities for this year's rate cycle and the data that we collected from the data collection tool and some of the estimates that we've made based on other data. So if we go to the next slide. So this is the same slide we've shown the last few meetings. It's the priorities, the focus areas that we wanted to take a look at this year. The areas in gray are areas that the data, we hope to collect that data from the data collection tool. The areas in white are other data sources. And we'll go into some of these details here. Let's go on to the next slide. So the data collection tool for fiscal year 25 went out on May 12th of 2023. There was 2 question and answer periods on May 24th and May 31st. And then we asked all providers to respond by June 9th. In the end, we got 50 responses with varying levels of data for different components on that response. There was, we were specifically looking for information on the cost of program supports and facility costs. That was a primary focus. And we got around 50 responses with some sort of data in those areas. We also asked, as was mentioned, the number of hours and the turnover rates for training, and we had about 45 responses. And we asked some questions that were more informational about structural change. That was like group size. And we were collecting data that would let us look at how well we could measure things like non-billable costs. So currently, we've pulled that data in. We're in the process of validating it, looking through it. Let's go on to the next slide. We'll check this data for the statistical significance. We're going to look through and make sure that we have that the data is consistent with other sources of data in other states, particularly making sure that there's this data. So one thing that's often asked is how much data do we need in order to give an accurate response? And the initial rule of thumb that was mentioned in one of these meetings was maybe 40 responses might be adequate, but it is contingent on that data being consistent. There's no fixed number, right? The amount of data that is necessary depends on how consistent that data is with itself, how consistent it is with the previous data that we've collected, whether there appears to be lots of outliers. So we're checking through those data piece by piece to see if the answers seem reasonable. And our goal is to report this analysis at the next RAG meeting after we've had a chance to go through it. So we did get about 40 responses, but those haven't been vetted yet. Those haven't been looked at. So that would represent maybe a maximum number of responses. So we're not in a position to say whether we have sufficient data to make adjustments to the program support or the facility cost components yet, but we are reviewing it. We did get that data. We appreciate it. As was mentioned, more data is always better, but also consistent data is important. So we'll return to this topic next month once we've had a chance to look through it. I wanted to
Caleb, can I just jump in here? So Christian, this goes back to your question about, it's the tool has been voluntary, but the response rate is not great, right? So back to the first question about, rate changes. The best way to make those decisions is the more data we have, then we can understand what the mean, the median is, the high, the max, the min. But with the lower numbers, especially it's not consistent across all the sections that need to be filled, it's really hard to make decisions. And if we can't make decisions, then my fear is that there's no rate change, right? So, and that's what you all need, or what I'm hearing and what I've heard from some of the outside meetings, to provide the services that you all provide. So that's why we want to move to the mandatory participation, because some of the providers are doing it, but it doesn't benefit all the providers if everyone doesn't do it, because there may not be enough information to make decisions on.
Yes, and if I didn't make myself clear, I am very thankful that the decision was made to make it mandatory, because the data is absolutely critical. And without that mandatory requirement, you're going to get what you get now, which is partial compliance and partial data. So thank you.
What is the percentage? Can you give us that? I don't know how many DAHAB providers there are.
does the state want to respond to that?
Caleb, I would need to look at our data on the number of DAHAB providers. I don't have that at the tip of my hat.
Sent it out to roughly 180 providers, so that's about a 28% response rate.
But I know, Steve, that I got it and I don't have a DAHAB. So I don't know that that's accurate data. I would appreciate if we could get accurate data so we could get real percentages here. How many active rehabilitation providers are in the state of Maryland right now? And we would have a better idea of the actual percentage of participation, because I think it did get sent out. People may have a license to do something, but they're not active providers of the service. So I think you want to get those, especially for the secretary, to know what the response rate really was. We may have had actually a very good response rate if we don't know what to put it against. And maybe Max, maybe you know better the percentage of active rehabilitation centers.
Well, I was actually going to add, I did hear from some providers that because their DAHAB was either closed or barely, barely supporting a few people for the years that the year that the data was requested, chose not to respond. So that's another factor in there as well.
So Laura, if we can get that information from you, because then we should be taking them out of the denominator, right? So
right, absolutely.
To Karen, your point about making sure that what we're looking at is accurate. So if 40 responses is not out of 180, but out of 50, then that might change how we use that information. So if you can provide that, that would be helpful for us as we look at the denominator. So Karen, we didn't provide a percentage. Nick was just giving you a ballpark. We just gave you the absolute number of responses. But again, the more data we have in a particular block, clearly the better for us to come up with the right rate for that service.
Absolutely, agreed.
And that would be a number that would best come from DDA. Just close that loop.
You should be able to look in both PCIS2 and in LTSS to get that pretty quickly.
I just made a request for that information, so if I get it during this meeting, we can share it. Otherwise, we can send that.
Thanks, Nick.
So, Laura, I think the secretary's point, asking for some additional insight from you, was your comment that you've received feedback from agencies that they either did not provide services even though they had an active license, or had so few individuals being covered. That is good information that if you could provide a number, it would help us.
Sure, I have some responses and I can ask at least my members to let me know more fully if they decided for those reasons not to respond.
This is Scott, and we do provide DAHAB services, and we did respond, just for the record. It does seem like a low number for some reason to me, which makes me wonder if we know who responded and we know who provides rehabilitation services, is there a follow-up we could provide? I know we wanted to get this information back quickly, and I certainly appreciate that. The timeline was short and it was a heavy lift, especially during that period of time. And I would anticipate that some providers, quite frankly, just couldn't lift it at that point. And as much as we wanted to get it done quickly, it may be worth an extension. It seems, and yet we don't know, maybe it's a good percentage, but it looks kind of low to me.
One of the reasonableness checks that we do as part of the process, we have not gotten to that step, is we do compare the information that we've been provided to data files that the state gives us so that we can understand, are these the large providers, what percentage of the total spend we have. We just don't have that step done, but that's good feedback, Scott. We appreciate the comment.
The last thing I'll say is I think that because the data collection tool that was the short-term DAHAB request and the bigger general ledger tool request that went out, I guess, within a week to 10 days after that. I mean, I think we all knew that there would probably be some confusion, and by having the two go out so close together, it might affect you know, the response, in addition to providers, you know, I think having so much on their plate that it was a challenge for those reasons as well.
I have a question about just playing this out, Caleb. So we have 50, and you mentioned 40 is kind of a target. You know, honestly, in my experience, I was actually quite pleased that you got 50, because I thought that was pretty good compared to, I thought in like last year's in the RAG, we had even fewer providers respond to some of the survey information, like around transportation. So did you have a target in, you know, I know you said you didn't have a target in mind, but just playing this out, would you not move forward with the analysis? Because to me, at least, some data is better than the 2014 GLs that the original assumptions are based on.
Yeah, certainly. We will always look at the data, and if we got 10 responses, but they were all super consistent and really reliable, and they seemed like they were very detailed, and you know, that in some circumstances might be adequate, but we got 50 responses got sent back, but there's really only about 40 that had some data in there, and we haven't gone through and we have to check that data. I can see initially that there's some that are really large outliers in the data, and there's, you know, one that's 0 for program support. So there could be, you know, anywhere from 0 to 250% might be the responses, and we know that those extremes are not reasonable numbers. So we have to look at it and try and figure out, did they misunderstand the question, or you know, is it consistent with other information that we have? You know, we will certainly do our best to come up with, if it is possible to determine a reasonable number from this and provide an update, we will. But if in the end we don't feel that these answers are reliable, then we will continue to use the existing number, which is to say, I mean, that the purpose of the BRIC is that these percentages in general should be consistent from year to year. It's not expected. We will be, you know, every year the wage is adjusted, but these are percentages built on top of that. So it's not like there isn't any adjustment. The adjustment is built into the wage. These components are adjusted if we think these percentages that people spend on program supports has changed dramatically. And so we'll do our best to update it with the data that we have, but we obviously have to take a look at it. And we're digging into that now. I'm just not ready to make any decisions or make any pronouncements on whether this will be adequate at this point. But realistically, it's 40 is probably the maximum pieces of data we got, and some of those are probably not usable. So it's going to be somewhere below 40 in the end. When I show you a graph of the responses, the distribution of the responses for this percentage spent on program support, it's going to be some number less than 40 in the end. So, but that's not a hard and fast number. It just depends on how good the data is.
And do you plan to follow up with the providers who might look like outliers to just understand their numbers? I know in the last round of the data collection tool, there were some outliers, and it was either followed up or, just kind of eliminated the tails, the too low and too high, and went with the data. So this sounds like a different process than what was followed previously.
No, it's not intended to be a different process. So we're still, in the end, we probably will either use the median or a trimmed mean, depending on the shape of that distribution. So we will exclude outliers if they don't seem reasonable. This data collection tool, which, to be clear, is distinct from the general ledger, as Laura was saying, it went out on May 12th, and we asked people to return it by June 9th. In the end, we saw most of those responses come in kind of in the last few days of that period, but it was out for about a month. And there's, in order to complete our analysis and then make decisions based on that analysis, there's just certain, milestones we have to meet in order to close this out, in this cycle. But we will certainly follow up where it seems warranted, where it seems that we'll be able to get with a follow-up. If we feel that we can get better data, we'll certainly do that. So at this point, if there aren't any other questions, we're going to talk about some of the other components, and I'm going to start with the training component. It's a bit of a hybrid. It uses data from the data collection tool, but also from the state. And Chris is going to talk about the training component. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Caleb. So we did discuss, reviewing the training component for the fiscal year 25 rates. And just to kind of give some context to this, the component's developed using two pieces. And so for the first piece, we're looking at the number of hours of training required for staff. That essentially becomes our numerator. So DDA has worked to update a new training matrix, which they mentioned, and that lists the required training material for providers. So we've reviewed the training matrix with DDA to determine the duration for each of the training materials. And on this slide, we have a small table that indicates the training hour assumption changes from the current rate development to fiscal year 25. And the summary shows an increase in training hours for DSP1s with behavioral and medication training or without it. So they're both, seeing an increase. And I just want to point out, as I mentioned, this is the first piece of information used to develop a training component. So the next piece will come from the review of the DCTs that Caleb had been talking about. So in order to apply those training hours, we need to see how many people needed that training, including turnover, and divide those total hours across the hours worked. So we asked for that information. We did see a lot of responses on the turnover and the employee status there on hours, everything like that. But like Caleb mentioned, we're in the process of kind of validating that data and starting to aggregate it and do some analyses. So we don't really have any results at the moment to share with that piece. So we just wanted to share with you what we have at the moment. We're showing the one piece here, but we can't really necessarily project what an impact to training would be using only that one piece. We'll have to see what shakes out from the DCT, and we will share that with you. The plan is to share that in the next meeting so we can have a little bit better picture of how this would play out.
Chris, this is Nick. Can I just add a little something to what you shared?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. So just to make everyone take a sigh of relief, the DSP1 that went from 63 hours to 76, that wasn't a whole bunch of new trainings that were added to the requirements. That really was an accurate reflection looking at the training matrix that you have all now have access to, and the many of you that helped contribute to that, to accurately reflect the hours that those trainings are taking, but then also to make sure that they were all included based on what's in rule, policy, waiver, COMAR. So I don't want anyone walking away from this meeting thinking DDA slipped in a few extra trainings and so that we increase the hours. That's not the case.
I just want to thank DDA for the clarification and the clarity that you gave us on the training. I think it's been a little wishy-washy for quite some time and people not knowing, so I really appreciate you being incredibly concise about what it is that's required for level staff. Thank you.
And Karen, I think to all of you that are on this call that have helped contribute to that, it was such a great collaboration, and I think we ended up with a really amazing tool. So thank you so much.
This is Scott, and I would echo Karen. I agree. It was great to see that document. Two comments I would make. One is people that we support may need medication administration when they're in a group, which they may need behavioral supports when they're in a group. So they may not be getting rehabilitation 2-to-1, 1-to-1, and yet the staff may still need the training. So please consider that. And then I don't know if there's any, there's lots of other training that as a company, as a business, we have to have all our DSPs participate in, whether they're DDA required or not. We wouldn't be in business if we didn't do some of these other trainings. So whether there's some factor for that. Just going forward, I guess I'm most concerned that we still need to give people their meds, and we still need to have our DSPs trained to provide supports, even if for behavioral supports, even if they're in a group.
Thanks. Yeah, that's really good feedback. That's something we can discuss with DDA. I'm not sure. Do you have a sense for how frequently that might be the case? I know that's kind of a putting you on the spot, off the cuff number, but just trying to get an idea of, in group settings, is that a very common thing or a very uncommon scenario?
Every single day.
Sure. Okay.
Those folks need their meds every single day, and they may not be, we may not be billing at a 15-minute increment for that period of time. They're part of the group.
Sure. We have folks also in the same situation.
Okay.
Yeah,
thanks.
of course. I think that's across the board. It's just a practice.
It is. Yeah.
Yeah, for everybody.
Absolutely.
Whether it's in their homes or in the community or wherever. Yeah, and a lot of times because our staff cross work with people who they may not work with on a regular basis. We may do the medication training for a larger group of people than they're doing one-on-one supports with at any given time. So because we can't ever be without.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, that's exactly why I want to have those RAG discussions, to share that information and see how we can apply it better. So we will discuss that with DDA and how we want to proceed there. But I think that's really valuable feedback. So thank you.
Think of medication training a bit as universal design.
Great. So if there aren't any other questions, I'll hand it back over to Caleb to start walking through some of the BLS wage adjustments there.
Thanks, Chris. If we go on to the next slide. So, obviously we hashed out a lot of this discussion earlier, but I'm going to go through and just sort of explain for those that might have gotten lost or aren't enmeshed in the details of this, exactly what we're talking about when we say we're going to update the BLS wages and the different inflation factors that we're going to use to determine the wage estimate for 2025. So we use the Bureau of Labor Statistics estimates of wages for particular categories that we believe are analogous for the provider, the direct care providers. In this case, when looking at rehabilitation, we typically use this social and human service assistance category, which is 21-1093 in the BLS data when we look at that. I've graphed here the estimated median wage, although we use higher percentages in some of the categories for rehabilitation. For example, small group is 75 and large group is 90%. We use the 75th and 90th percentile. Median would be the 50th percentile, the middle one. So the wage, the dollars are on the left, that's the wage. The percentages on the right represent the inflation factor. So the blue boxes along the bottom represent our estimate of how much those wages are inflated from the year before. So we think that the 2018 wage might have gone up 2% in 2019. And if we look at this category in 2018, the estimated wage, and this is for the geographic differential, that area that is covered by the 5 counties, Calvert, Charles, Frederick, Montgomery, and Prince George. So when we look at the wages in that region for this category in 2018, it was $18.92. So that's the starting point. And then we project that forward using those various inflation factors to where we think the wage will be in 2024 or 2025 in this case. When we talk about updating the BLS wages, it means going back and looking at the very most recent data that the BLS has in these categories, and that during this analysis was 2021. And so if we look at the 2021 data, it shows $20.75. And that's very close to what the 2018 data said if you account for the inflation that was apparent during those 3 years between 2018 and 2021. When we project all of those forward to 2025 in this case, you'll see that the wages grow substantially up to close to $25 in the end, the endpoints there. But the difference between these two lines is the difference that we've been talking about, that percentile increase if we update the BLS wages. So some of the discussions that we touched upon earlier are whether to use the CPI or COLA. That's the information along the bottom there. Prior to 2022, we had been using CPI adjustments, and then starting in 2022, rather than just using a straight CPI number, we had gone to using the legislatively chosen COLA as a proxy for how much we think the wages have adjusted. There isn't some magical source that will tell us exactly what the wages are. We use the BLS data because it is consistently collected, it is reliable, it is updated annually. There is a lag to it, however, and that's why we have to use this BLS numbers. Now, if there's errors in our estimate of that inflation, those are captured, or those are corrected each time we do an update. So we're not going to go forward, 10 years from now, continuing to estimate the 2018 wages. We'll update it with a more recent estimate from the BLS. So these errors will not accumulate, whatever errors there are will not accumulate indefinitely. We don't expect there to be large errors. When we look at the 2018 compared to the 2021 estimate, those errors are pretty small and they're scattered. For some categories, they're positive, and for some categories, they're negative. this year we're focused only on the day habilitation and employment services, in which case some of them, for example, at the 75th percentile, I'm going to show you on the table on the next page, they're positive, but at the 90th percentile, they're actually slightly negative. So we don't have any reason to think those estimates are biased. Now, there are concerns that everybody has about what inflation has been recently and what that number really is. And I'll tell you up front that there isn't any real number. There isn't some fixed number that we can go look up. People often use the CPI as a proxy for what we expect these wage estimates to change, but those are national numbers for consumer spending. They're not exactly on point. We have also taken a look at the Mid-Atlantic data, which is when you break down estimates of inflation, you can look at particular regions, and Maryland is in the Mid-Atlantic region. And you can look at inflation in some subcategories, quite a few of them, and the one that would be most directly applicable might be medical care. So you could look at how much inflation has gone up in the Mid-Atlantic region for medical care, for example. And that might be a slightly more precise number, but it also bounces around some. And I know that, 9% was mentioned, and that has not been the actual, that would not be an accurate representation of what inflation in this area has been during that period. But like I said, there's no fixed, these are all estimates of what we think the wage is based on surveys done by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And these are also prospective. So we're looking forward. We don't know what the inflation will be between 24 and 25 at this point. So we're doing our best to estimate what that will be. That's in the future. What they have decided to do based on adjustments that they're making to the minimum wage, which will have carry on impacts to wages even above the minimum wage will be impacted to some degree, is to estimate 8% as the wage differential between 24 and 25. So that's intended to represent a 4% inflation factor for 25 and a 4% inflation factor for 28, but they're pulling that all forward to January 1, 2024. So, and we've had 4% as our estimate for the last 3 years. There was a spike sometime between 22 and 23 where it got higher for a period of time, but it wasn't consistently high, at 9% for that period. I don't want to belabor the point, but when, for example, the Congressional Budget Office or the Survey of Economic Forecasters look forward to 24-25, they're currently, for the national CPI number, which that's just a national consumer spending number, the national CPI number, they're estimating 2.5% inflation between 24 and 25. That's the current consensus estimate. So to the extent that we know that these numbers are estimates, they don't necessarily reflect reality. We won't even know reality until sometime after 2025 when we know what those numbers are. At some point, we will adjust the wages to account for, and that will capture the inflation that we may have misestimated during this period. To the extent that we are off in our estimation of what inflation in wages in this area are in the next few years, that's going to be captured the next time we do an update of all of the wages with newer data. When we have BLS data from 2024, then that's going to take out these estimates that we've made between 2022 and 2023, for example. So that's just to give you kind of what you're going to see in the next table is the actual what the numbers are and what that means for the rates. But I just wanted to explain just so we all had a common understanding of what we're talking about when we're talking about these wage adjustments. So if we go to the next slide, I've got a table
Caleb, before we go to go there,
back to slide.
I wanted to just make sure I understood your numbers and the graph, and so did you use the CPI like all services or medical services in 2019, 2020, and 2021, or did you use medical?
I believe those were at that time, and we build on these. So, you know, those we don't want to go back and retroactively change what we use, but I believe at the time they were using the basic national CPI numbers.
So
not necessarily.
All expenses.
Yeah, all consumer expenses.
Okay, yeah, because I mean those are low because that was a period of low inflation and underrepresented the BLS. Yeah, so there was you know, because I think those accumulated to about a 5.2% increase, but the actual BLS was 9.6%. So it seems like whatever was historically used, that was too low, which is why your green line is higher than your orange. And I think, you know, back to the conversation we started with, I think, it would be really helpful if we could actually have the actual CPIs for 22 to 23 versus the 4 and the 8, just so we have an understanding of how the legislative rate increases compare to the CPIs.
Certainly we can do that, but there's an understanding that the national CPI may not be the right number, and it's not going to, you know, as I said, some of them, when we looked at those changes between 2018 and 2021, some of them are positive. For example, this one is, but for the large group at the 90 percentile, it was negative. So, and when we looked at, you know, we went and looked at all of the various categories and different percentiles, and they were scattered. They were pretty scattered. There didn't appear to be a large bias in these estimates. So whether one particular service in one particular year might be high or might be low, we're never going to hit it exactly every time. But we do hope to have an unbiased number.
And I don't disagree with that. I think, you know, an objective, independent, unbiased number, and you know, my experience in other states, and CMS has a you know, a standard deck on trending these BLS wages, and the most common index that's used is the CPI. So that's why I'm you know, curious as to your thinking around departing from the CPI.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that CPI is the standard most people use because that data is updated most frequently. It's the most common understanding. That's what people are familiar with, and there's a good understanding of it. But as you dig down into each of these individual categories, those numbers fluctuate, and whether or not that's best practice or not, you know, I think there has to be an understanding that there isn't a fixed number, and that what we want is an unbiased estimate, and we want to update it at a reasonable frequency to correct any errors so they don't accumulate. And we agree with that.
Caleb, I do have a question. I do want to point out, I don't think that you know, to your point that it's an unbiased, we want an unbiased number. I would just argue that the rate increases do not meet that standard. But putting that aside, my question is, because of the acceleration of the minimum wage, the rate increase was accelerated, and there is a total of a 12% increase for FY24. So I'm just wondering if you can explain I guess, you know, the series of 4s and then the 8 for 25, how the total 12% ultimately in 1 year is how it appears here spread across these years.
Yeah, and Robert can speak to this. He was intimately involved in that part of it. But the 4% for 2024 is between July 1 of 2023 and January 1 of 2024. And then the 8% that I show here in the column in 2025 starts on January 1, 2024. I believe that's correct, right, Robert?
Yes, that's correct. So you basically have, half of the fiscal year reflected in 24 and the other half reflected in 25 for the fiscal year. And these are representing calendar years.
And are they a year behind?
These represent the percentage increase from the previous year. So 2024 is a 4% increase over 2023, and 2025 and it's actually by January 1 of 2024, but fiscal 25 will be an 8% increase over 2024.
So are these years fiscal years or calendar years?
As shown here, these are calendar years, but we're using those for the fiscal year that starts preceding that calendar year, I guess you would say. Because fiscal year 2025 starts right July 1, 2024. That's the 8%. Fiscal year 2024 starts July 1st, 2023. So there's been a 4% increase in that time period. So,
right,
so you could move that 8% over a half space if it would make more sense, mentally, but like, I didn't.
2025 means fiscal year 2025.
Yeah.
And 2024 means fiscal year 2024. It's the way you just explained it.
Yeah. But like, for example, the CPI data from the first 3 data points is technically for the calendar years for those, but we use them for the fiscal year. So the data comes from the calendar year and the BLS. BLS is collecting calendar year data, but we use it on the fiscal year following, preceding, I guess.
Right, but in that case, the 8% would be 2024, not 4%.
No.
I mean, if you're doing it on calendar year, right, the 8% hits January 1 of 24.
Yes. So we're going to take the 24 rates, the current 24 rates, and increase them by 8% starting on January 1. So the 24 rates have already been released. They're out. We're going to take those rates and increase them 8% starting on January 1, 2024.
But if you're, I guess if you're, so it's a year delayed because that 8% takes effect January 1 of 24, right?
Yes.
January 1 of 24 would be both calendar year and fiscal year 24.
Yeah, so when we calculate the 25, and in fact, the 24 rates are going to get updated 8%, and then we'll add that 8% to, I mean, that will carry on to the 25 rates. So right now, well, for July 1 of 2023, we have the 24 rates. Robert's uploaded those have been distributed. Everybody can see the 24 rates, which go into effect July 1. When we actually do like the actual calculation we're going to do, we're going to take those 24 rates and update them by adding 8% to them, and that'll go into effect January 1.
Caleb, I think.
Sorry, if somebody else maybe wants to jump in.
I was just going to say we could just amend this slide before we send it out. So you have 2024, maybe that's Rev 1, and then 2024 Rev 2. So that reflects the fiscal year and shows that, the second part of the year, they'll increase again by 8%. I think the calendar of 2025 is probably throwing people off.
Okay,
Yeah, I think that would be clearer. Thanks.
sure. We'd be happy to do that. So in terms of the impact to the rates, if we could go forward one slide.
Can I ask a question? I mean, I'm going to ask for some time away from this meeting with you, Caleb, or somebody to get deeper into this, because it appears to me, and I may be wrong on this, that you are mixing modalities here, and that we're losing integrity in the BLS code and the BLS categories with the inflationary piece or the CPI or whatever we're using. By adding in so many different variables, we're losing integrity. And so I guess I'm going to ask for some time away for you to walk through this, because I feel like the integrity of the system that we're using is for me.
Yeah, I mean, I don't dispute this. This can be complicated. We're doing our best to clarify it and simplify it. But when you dig under the hood and you start tinkering with these things, there's I wouldn't even say it's complicated. There's lots of pieces, right, to keep track of, and so we are doing our best to explain the decisions. I think that the takeaway that I'd hope you take away from the last slide is that when we update the BLS wages, that's essentially removing any of the inflation, any error that might have been introduced by our estimate of the inflation prior to that date. So when we update to 2021 BLS data, we've removed any errors in our estimate between 2018 and 2021 on what the inflation was. It doesn't mean there isn't error in that actual BLS estimate, but then we project that forward with what we think the inflation is going to be forward to 2025 or whatever the next year is, and we update that every year. So, these estimates are never going to be perfect, but we're not like leaving anything out. We have accounted for inflation. It is getting updated every year. Your overall level of your rates is going up every year as we estimate this. And if we're incorrect about how much inflation there was between 2023 and 2024 or 24 and 25, then that will get corrected the next time we do a BLS wage estimate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As an adult learner, what I would appreciate is if I could see your formula.
Yeah.
That would be very helpful to me if I could see that formula. I don't know if that would be helpful to others, but seeing the formula would be very helpful.
We're happy to share whatever material the state thinks is would like us to share. Certainly we can share
Thank you.
this material.
That would be appreciated.
That seems odd to me, and we're going on about this, but here we have an estimate of the BLS wage for 2024 and 2025, and we ain't using it for nothing.
Right.
We're using
That's
2021
exactly
for
the integrity
services. We're not using. I think that's what we've been all kind of struggling with a little bit this whole meeting.
Yeah, there has to be some integrity in it.
Yeah, I think I fully support Karen's point, and I guess it's part of what I was trying to say earlier. And if, I think just the other thing I want to say is what makes me nervous about this approach of, might be CPI, might be the rate increase, may change from year to year. I appreciate that it'll be updated annually, but there will always need to be projection and adjustment. And my worry is either we get too far behind, but my other worry is we get too far ahead. And as we saw the negative 5%, I'm really glad the department made the decision to not adjust that rate down. But, downward rate adjustments would really cause a lot of instability. in our service system. So, you know, that's the other risk it feels like we're taking by taking this approach.
So I'm not sure I totally understood all of these arguments, but to the extent we are able to estimate what the wages are, this is our best estimate of those. We are not we are not secretly making some other estimate somewhere else or only picking highs or lows. We're going in and trying to estimate this as best we can with the data that is available. And that's always been, we want this to be a data-driven process. We've always intended that. There's no, we are not trying to make this unduly complicated, certainly. What we are trying to do is best reflect what we think the actual costs of providing these services are based on the data that's available. And so we use the BLS data as what we think the wages are, and then we increment that each year based on estimates of what we think that, how much we think that wage is probably inflated during that time period. And at its root, those are the two basic components which all the other brick components are built on top of. So, I know previously there was decisions made about which categories to use for which workers and which percentiles. For example, here we use the 75th percentile and the 90th percentile in these wage categories for these services for what we think is the correct employee code or category code in the BLS. So, those are decisions that have been made, and I think they're consistent with our best guess as to how much those people providing these services cost. Sometimes our estimates are positive and negative when we check them against reality, and obviously we can't consistently just only take the positive estimates and never take the negative estimates. But in this case, the state made the decision that for this year at least, we're going to take we're going to increase the rates for the 2-to-1, 1-to-1 and small group, but we're going to hold the large group with no change. We are not going to update that one. And part of the reasoning there is that there was a lot of variation in the BLS data for 2021 in particular. It was because a whole lot of people lost their jobs at the start of the pandemic, and then they got a lot of some large fraction of them got their jobs back, kind of over the next year or so. And what it caused when you look at the data, you can see that there was this kind of weird fluctuation that happened in the BLS data that in 2021 that may or may not reflect, the reality. The best we can do is when we update it, next year, we'll get rid of that estimate and, we'll have a better starting point.
So Caleb, to that point, Karen, I hear you loud and clear. Can we do the exercise that Karen is asking for, and after this meeting, show the math that got us to the table and figure out a way to share it in a visual that doesn't look too complicated or require explanation, but that can walk everyone on this call? I know that's complicated, but we're going to try to uncomplicate it so we can be transparent about how we got to the numbers. And then Karen, Scott, Laura, you all can weigh in and say, does that make sense? Or does it, if there's still questions to answer? Because again, we want to make sure that we're not overcomplicating the process and that it's clear how we got from point A to point B. So will that work, Karen? Address your question?
Yeah, I appreciate. I think that would. I do think the integrity of is important.
So Caleb and Steve and company, if we could work on providing that and coming up with a visual, I'll use myself as the barometer for understanding it, and then share it with the group. And if it still doesn't answer your questions, you can let us know.
Yeah,
we can do that.
Karen, does that work for you?
Thank you.
So as I said, that difference between those two lines is about a 1% increase in the 2-to-1, 1-to-1 and small group services for rest of state outside of the geographic differential region. Inside the geographic differential region, it's about 6%. So it's the estimates were higher within the sort of the Washington metro area. For a large
Caleb,
group,
can I ask for one additional thing? Is
Yep.
which BLS code for you to put in the matrix that you're going to do or in the formula? Which specific BLS code are you using? I think that would be really helpful for us to have perspective, and I think that would really clarify on the integrity. So not just the number, but what BLS code are you using for each of the positions? Because I know that you're using something a little bit different for employment than you are for day have, and you're doing something a little different. So it'd be really great if we knew, because
there's two codes.
that's the other piece that I think we could bring insight to. We could bring some insight into what we believe, you know, if indeed some of these BLS codes have changed. And I know that there is some both legislative work as well as the administration on community living being done right now around these codes and around our industry. So I think for us to continue to be aware of what it is, the specific codes you're using would be great.
Yeah, and just to tell you, it's 21-1093, but we'll for day habilitation, but we'll include that information. And it's a different code for employment services. I don't happen to remember the number off the top of my head, but it's one number for employment service, or one code for employment services, one code for
Caleb, I think you're muted.
Oh, sorry if you couldn't hear me.
No, we could hear you.
I could hear you.
So,
sorry, Caleb, I have a question for you on this chart. Last month, you know, I'm understanding that the adjusted 21 BLS wages is really the projected fiscal 24. I'm assuming, and last month that it was a 3% increase in the rest of state, and now it's 1%, and it looks like just the rest of state numbers changed. So can you help me understand what changed from what was presented in the RRAG last month on the rest of the state?
Yeah, and yeah, so what changed was we went, so there is a, like I said, I don't want to say it's complicated, but in this case, the BLS data is not broken down quite so cleanly into the geographic differential in the rest of state. What the BLS provides is wage data for Maryland and for some various metropolitan areas within Maryland or surrounding regions. And so in order to break out this estimate into the geographic differential region and the rest of state, we have to map the BLS data into those two regions. And so we assigned each county to the appropriate metro area as defined in the BLS data. So the BLS data might have, you know, for filling in the surrounding regions there, and it captures some of those counties and, you know, some smaller metropolitan areas like Hagerstown or, you know, I'm not going to remember all of these categories off the top of my head, but anyway, we map each county to a metropolitan area, or if there isn't any nearby metro area, the BLS does provide kind of a rest of state, which captures every area that is not in the metro areas that they have. So we map that each county to a metro area, and then we weight the wage estimate based on the number of members served in those counties and the wage that is appropriate for that county, whether that's based on the nearest metro area or the rest of state estimate. And when we went through and did that, and there was a change in what was used in 2018 versus used in 2021 as far as what metro areas the BLS data had. Anyway, when we got in there did that estimate, it changed the rest of state number slightly, and it didn't impact the geo differential because that's essentially just using the Washington DC metro area. The BLS has an estimate for the metro area there, and it's just using that one number, and so that didn't change. But when we did this weighting of county by the number of clients in each county and the wage that we attach to that county based on the nearest metro area, or if it's a rural area using the rest of the state number, it changed this value slightly. So there was a change here. It came about when we dug into that estimate and updated the metro, the counties, and the weighting that we gave each county and how that was tied to the wage estimate for the nearest metro area. That's where it came from. It did change slightly.
Well, yeah, it changed, yeah, from 3% down to 1%, but then the large group didn't change, so that's where I was confused. I was actually able to replicate most of your numbers, but I wasn't able to replicate the rest of state numbers based on the weighting. So if you change the weighting from what was done last time, that would explain it. I just didn't understand why it would change for large group, or not change for large group, and did change for small group 1-to-1, 2-to-1. So maybe you could take a double look at that, just because it's important.
Slightly on the large group. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, but this is just showing this single significant digit. But if you showed it out to 3 decimal places, there was a change in the large group, but it wasn't a significant. It didn't change it from 0, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Hopefully, I can clarify that the large group changed by 0.1%. So you can't see it when we are just sharing the broader percentage.
Okay.
Okay. Great. So thank you, Caleb, and I want to thank the RAG members as well. I know that we have run over. I'll just leave this slide up because we're going to continue. We're just going to underscore some important points related to BLS. I think it's worth repeating that the BLS data actually showed a wage decrease for the large group in the geodifferential areas. That said, as we stated, we have made the policy decision to not decrease the rate for large group at this time due to the possible lingering effects of the pandemic on the data. That is not to say that BLS wages would not be adjusted down in future adjustments if supported by the BLS data. So I think it's important that we all understand that as well. And can we jump to slide 19, please? Unfortunately, we're out of time, so we don't have time for any walk-on items. But please, if you have any questions or other topics you'd like to, that you have questions about, please send an email to the RAG email account, which is on the slide. Next slide, please. So next steps for the DDA team, we're going to get out the number of meaningful day have and employment providers so that we can calculate a response rate for the data collection tool. The goal is to share the results of the data analysis at the next meeting. We'll welcome any feedback on the points raised today related to medication training. We'll take that back and have an internal discussion, and Optimus will show the math behind how we got to the current numbers for the BLS wage slides.
Robert, I thought we went until 2:30. I thought these meetings were 2 hours.
Well, we shortened today's meeting, Laura, because we didn't have a lot of topics. We weren't ready to share the analyses from the data collection tool.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think everybody had 2:30. When the invite that I received said till 2:30, so that's why I asked.
Okay. Next slide, please.
Well, we should be good until 2:30, at least the DDA guys.
Okay. Do we have any walk-on items?
This is not walk on, Robert, but you mentioned medication training, but the same applies for behavioral supports. A person may need behavioral supports all day long, but maybe in a group as opposed to one-to-one. And thus the staff need the training.
Great, thank you, Scott. I see that Nick was writing that down, so that's been noted.
Can I just ask a question? Are you all saying that you're going to change the BLS wage for DAHAB and employment, but not CDS?
That's correct, Laura. We are adjusting the BLS wage for the DAHAB and employment services rate. Those are the two services that we collaborated on and identified as the rate priorities for FY25.
Right, I know that, but I guess I wasn't thinking that that would mean that the BLS adjustment would be different, but that, you know, the way we tackled day habilitation was to talk about some of the other costs like transportation, and it feels concerning to, you know, when you have 3 daytime services and people go between those different types of support to raise 2 of them and not the third one. I mean, I don't know how the providers feel on this group, but I don't know, that seems concerning. Especially given that CDS is a service that more people are doing and certainly one that the department supports, you know, as a best practice.
I don't remember that as a discussion point. I thought that the point that was always raised, well, Laura Howell, you raised all the time, was about dehabilitation rates, and the providers who were doing dehabilitation, their rates are way too low. And I thought that that was the initial discussion. And then we looked at some of the other employment areas. And I thought that's where we landed on those two.
Right, but yes, I agree that that was definitely an issue that we raised and was a priority, but you know, you've kind of got the BLS, and then you've got other factors that I think we all agreed needed to be looked at, like, you know, transportation, staff ratios, you know, whatever the items were that we chose to look at. But BLS to me, again, seems like however we get there is a data-driven number that should be consistent. I wasn't thinking that that was necessarily a lever to, you know, fluctuate in order to address that underfunding. Because I don't think it was necessarily the driver of the underfunding. I think there were other structural issues that drove the underfunding of DAHAB and employment.
And I thought that that's what we committed to, DAHAB and employment, to look at that and to move forward.
Right, but I don't think we want community development services to fall behind because the other two items were prioritized for a number of reasons.
Yeah, just remind the team, this obviously is not the only bite at the apple. We'll be going through a similar process as we did for the FY25 rates for the FY26 priorities. And so, you know, I think when we start that next cycle, if that is something that we identify as a priority, then we can look at it at that point in time. But you know, we only had a finite amount of time to address, you know, what was identified as a rate priority, and that was DAHAB and employment services. But we've heard your feedback, so.
But let me ask again. I'm sorry. I thought the BLS would be adjusted, the wage number, the BLS number would be adjusted annually. Is that what we've been talking about?
No, we've never, as far as I understand, we've never committed to adjusting the BLS wage on an annual basis, Laura. We have talked about that adjustment during rebase years. But again, if it's identified as a priority for FY26, then we can certainly look at it then.
This is Donna. I'm a little confused, I guess, because I thought we were doing it annually also, which helps determine what the rate should be, not necessarily what it's funded. I don't know. I am a little confused.
In past rate setting cycles, what we have said is we will adjust the BLS by a trend factor. We've chosen to apply either CPI or COLA. We have not gone and adjusted the actual underlying BLS wage. It is an undertaking that we have not done in the past, and nor have we committed to doing annually. We have, though, committed to adjusting it with a trend factor.
And how often is that done with the trend factor?
So as part of the annual rate setting cycle, we have committed to apply those percentages on an annual basis, and then that information is forwarded to DDA as part of their policy decision as to whether to apply it.
Okay, so I think that's where at least my perception came from of annually, without perhaps understanding, the finer details of it with the trending versus the rate.
Yeah, I agree. I thought that's the trending, I guess, is what I thought was happening. So is what the department is saying is a policy decision has been made to not apply it to, not apply a trending increase to CDS.
Yeah, we were going to stay with employment and DAHAB.
This is Leslie. I think there's just that confusion. So all the BLS wages will have that applied inflation factor to go from 24 to 25, but the day habilitation and employment services will be the only services where we update the underlying BLS rate. So instead of using 2018 BLS data, day habilitation and employment services will now be using the 2021 BLS data trended forward. But all of the wages will have that applied trend factor moving to 24 to 25, because that's the commitment we make annually for the rates. Does that help clarify your question?
Well, it just seems inconsistent with all the discussion that we've had in terms of, does that mean that moving forward, and I understand that decisions will be made on an annual basis, but does that mean that, next year CDS, unless it's prioritized, that other services kind of stay based on much older BLS with trending data as opposed to actually using the most current data we have? That's what I feel like I hear you saying.
No, so let's take a step back for a second. The rate setting methodology has certain components to it. We as a group have solicited feedback from the advisory group for priorities. We are not able to adjust all of the different components for all of the different rates each year. And so, as Leslie said, we have made a commitment to apply a trend factor, but we will not update the base information. It is not possible for us to go through the process and consider all of the adjustments that need to be applied. So what we've done is we've worked with the advisory group to identify priorities, and in this instance, the priority was DAHAB and employment services. we updated the base BLS wage for that. That does not mean that we're going to update the base BLS wage for every service every year.
Okay, well, just to be clear, I was not asking the department to update every single factor. I understand that that is something that happens in rebasing years. I'm not sure I understand, having looked at the chart of wages that are used, BLS, for the different services. First of all, so many of them are the same. Not sure I really understand how challenging it would be to update, to use more updated BLS data. But yeah. I mean, what, 90% of the services, 80% of the services use the same BLS code?
I think that's something that that could be up for discussion, but there's probably more to that discussion. For example, like we were showing with the BLS updates here, we saw that some of them were negative, and I think one of the slides we had passed over there to make sure we had enough time indicated that the majority of codes were either negative or flat when we updated from 2018 relative to 2021 relative to 2018, using the factors that we had put into place. So I think on the surface, it might look like this is an easy task. We're just going to say, okay, we're going to apply this everywhere. And it seems easy enough to do that every year. And this is just this one thing that we're asking for. But that's within the context of a greater discussion where that might not be a reasonable approach, that might have some other complications. And I don't think we've had time to vet that whole conversation out with the RAG. So if that's something that we want to discuss as a potential for, changing the process, I think that's certainly something to discuss, but I don't think we would necessarily want to just jump into that right now.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you, Chris. Any other updates before we? Okay, so we look forward to our next meeting on Thursday, July 20th from 12:30 to 2:30. Keep in mind a majority of July's meeting will be dedicated to Optimus in summarizing their analysis of the data that was collected earlier this month. Members of the public who would like to observe the meetings can register through the DDA training calendar, which is linked on, next slide, slide 20, please, which is linked on this slide. Sorry, slide 20. So we've provided the link here. We've also provided the email address for Dr. Yamanja Smalls for folks who are registering and would like to request special accommodations. All meeting materials will be made available through the designated DDA webpage for this advisory group. And before we adjourn, I'd just like to pause to see if Deputy Secretary Simons or Secretary Herrera Scott wanted to close us out.
I'll just say thank you to everyone. I know this is really, really hard work, and there's lots of nuances in the data and the methodology, and I appreciate all the feedback and the discussion today.
Yeah, let me just add that we will work with Optimus and the request that came in from Scott, with you talking about behavior and medicine and medical medications during the group. All of those requests that Robert went through a little while ago, we will work with Optimus and get them before the secretary. As she said, she would be the barometer and move those along as quickly as possible. I don't want to wait until like the second or third week of July to put it in front of you. You should have time to be able to look at it, digest it, and we should have maybe offline discussions before we come back into our next meeting.
Okay, thank you. Enjoy the rest of the summer, and we'll see you in July.
Thank you.